After a somewhat disappointing Penticton Young Stars Classic, the Jets are now preparing themselves for what could be a very eventful preseason and training camp. Here's what lies ahead for the Jets, all coming right up on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. More than anything, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat over 50-plus infections. Get yours today at Jace Medical. That's JASE medical.com. Now, like I said, obviously, tonight's episode, it is kind of rolling into preseason and training camp, and this is an exciting time for the Jets, and also for the Jets fans. Not because this team is going to be like a true cup contender all the way around, but you know what? Listen, for all of the offseason dramas and things with this team, Winnipeg is already shaping up to have one of the better forward groupings around the entire league. This is a team that legit has some pretty good scoring depth thanks to the Dubois trade. It's rare that you have a 3-for-1 deal where the 3 players that you get in exchange for one actually upgrade multiple positions across your team. Usually when it's like a cap dump or something, it's not much of an improvement, but for where the Jets were last year and where they are now with Scheifele, Kupari, and Vilardi now joining, this team is significantly better and deeper just about in all facets up front. So this is a really exciting time. And Winnipeg Sports Talk was talking about it earlier with Mike McIntyre, looking at some of the training camps and or training camp lineups and stuff. And they had some interesting projected lines that I thought were worth discussing because the first one you'll see is Connor, Scheifele, and Vilardi. Now, for me, I sort of wonder if Vilardi is seen as either a center or a winger. And it's a question that I think Winnipeg is very keen to answer because at some point the expectation is if Scheifele is not, signing an extension, maybe he, kind of gets traded. And obviously that leaves a huge void down the middle for the Jets. I think it's a question that, we're going to get to later tonight just because I think the question of how you're going to arrange this group going forward is pretty hard to wrap your head around because Winnipeg has lots of guys who can play center, but we also haven't seen some of our most, I would say, brightest prospects actually get a chance to play down the middle, right? There are some guys who can probably do it, some who might even be more suited to the position than others, and we haven't seen them actually play that spot yet. So this training camp has a lot of really interesting storylines, but obviously, looking at the roster for training camp, the Jets have a pretty fun group. On Team Selanne, in net, you've got Thomas Milic, Oskari Salminen, and Laurent Brossoit. You can kind of tell that this is likely the more secondary group of goalies. You don't have Hellebuck here, but you have Brossoit, who's very clearly the backup for this upcoming season, and Salminen, who's usually been more of a moose goalie, but somebody that I think at some point they were hoping might actually manage to steal a few games for the Jets. Milic had a really good, I would say Penticton performance. He stole a game against Vancouver. Is it something that you expect him to do every game? Probably not yet. I think he's still got, plenty of developing and he's still just a young kid, but with a really good performance for Team Canada recently and now a solid showing for the Jets already, he has made a favorable first impression. In front of him will be Dylan DeMello, Brendan Dillon, Ville Heinola, Declan Chisholm, Jimmy Oligny, Tyrell Bauer, Artemi Ganayev, Nate Schmidt, Dean Stewart, and Simon Kubicek. Now, what's interesting about this group is you tend to notice a lot of players who are likely to be on the Moose. I would say DeMello and Dillon, of course, are going to be your two NHL veterans, along with Schmidt, who I wonder what's going to happen with Schmidt long term, just because it feels like the Jets have a big log jam, and at some point they're going to have to uncork that blue line jam with a trade of some sort. But let's assume that's later. Schmidt, DeMello, Dillon are going to anchor your I guess pairings with the kids, right? Because this is where you have usually one like Ville Heinola maybe matching up with a Schmidt or something. Maybe you have Chisholm with DeMello. You have all these options and young defenders who could probably do some decent work if they're paired with a guy with experience, right? Somebody who can look out for those details and keep them honest. So, yeah, an interesting group. It's nice to see Heinola still in the mix with things. I don't think he's really competing for a spot this year just because it feels like the Jets' blue line is more or less fixed in Bones' minds, but maybe there's more competition than I realize. Now, up front is where you have lots of skill and a lot of interesting names. You've got Iafallo, Harkins, Lowry, Toninato, Appleton, Ehlers, Bongiovanni, who you probably remember from the Moose, Lambert, Zhilkin, Malott, Niederreiter, Janssen Fjallby, Levis, Chibrikov, and Perfetti. This is like a lot of Winnipeg's, core of the future mixed with some of their present high-end skilled players. But you also have an interesting arrangement of players like Harkins who have kind of been on the periphery and are really fighting for spots. Janssen, I think at this point, is kind of on the fringes of the conversation for the Jets, but somebody who I think, if you play him on your fourth line or something, that's a pretty legit player there. And I think, his fantastic Moose scoring record maybe hasn't translated at the NHL level yet, but I still have faith and some level of confidence that if you put him in the right position, I do think he could actually play a really nice depth role. He's going to be fighting off guys like Janssen Fjallby and obviously Toninato. And look, most of those guys are probably bound for the Moose. But assuming that, you're looking at first call-ups, Harkins has reasonable amounts of competition to fend off. He's probably not going to make it into the starting lineup this year, but maybe with a first injury crisis, you might see him get called up. Now, on Team Numminen, you've got Hellebuck, DiVincentis, and Delia in net, which is, pretty cool. You've got DiVincentis, who I think a lot of people are sort of already maybe hailing as the next Hellebuck. A little bit early, let's slow down and give him time to develop. On the blue line, you've got Pionk, Sautner, Lundmark, Morrissey, Sandberg, Salamanson, Kuzman, Stanley, and Capobianco. This is kind of like a more, I would say, pro and veteran group. It's interesting to see Salamanson in this mixture because I thought he had a really impressive camp. I think he's shown super well with all of the Jets prospect games and tournaments. At this point, it's just him going back overseas for a little bit, then probably returning to North America, where he will hopefully seize a prime spot with the Moose and really prove that, long term, he fits into Winnipeg's top four on the right-handed side. So a lot of excitement there. You've got Stanley and Capobianco likely to be fighting for one of those third pairing spots. And then, of course, Sautner and Lundmark and some of the other Moose guys, they're just going to be here to provide some depth and maybe even, try and fight their way in for an NHL game or two should there be injuries. Now, this forward grouping, you'll see a lot more of Winnipeg's overall star talent. Nemesnikov, I know that's not the first thing that you'd probably expect when I say that, but Nemesnikov, Velarde, Kupari, Gustafsson, Jeffrey Veal, Morgan Barron, Torgerson, Barlow, Lucius, Nikkanen, Scheifele, Jakob Julian, CJ Cease, Parker Ford, Kyle Connor, and Christian Reichel all comprise what should be a pretty strong group. I think that this is the better of the two teams overall, but that's not to say that Team Selanne doesn't have quite a bit of star talent up front itself. So lots to kind of, digest and try and think about, because I think this is probably one of the more competitive Jets forward rosters that we've had. I think the Jets are likely to have some very tough competition and decisions to make, especially as guys fight for roster spots. Now, one of those questions and certainly one of the competitions is who's going to be playing down the middle in the event of, potential departures here for the team over the next few months. We'll dive into some really big center options and how the Jets might arrange this in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Chase Medical. You should always be empowered to care for yourself and those you love. And, during the unexpected, you want to have stuff on hand, stuff that helps you stay prepared and safe. Jace Medical offers the Jace case for all of your needs. The Jace case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use that covers over 50 different kinds of infections. That's a lot of preparation in just a very small, convenient package, especially for those of you who might be traveling. Maybe you're out of the country or just out, maybe across state or province lines, and you want something, a little bit of peace of mind. Jace Medical knows exactly what you're looking for, and they've got the Jace case just for you. Jace also makes it super convenient and super handy. They do everything from online evaluation of licensed pharmacy medications to ongoing consultation and care. So don't get caught unprepared. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at checkout on jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDON. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Thank you so much for joining us in tonight's episode as we talk about some interesting questions heading into, training camp and preseason. Obviously, the preseason schedule, is going to start here in just a couple of days, really. The Jets will be playing against Edmonton back-to-back over the weekend and on Monday. So, hey, that's pretty fun. In the meantime, though, next couple of days, we've got, Team Selanne and Team Numminen practicing, a couple of scrimmages, a couple of, little off and on skates, and then preseason kicks off on Sunday and Monday. So a lot for the Jets to get through, but obviously, with preparations kind of winding down here for the regular season, one of the biggest questions that I think the Jets have struggled to figure out is related to a C, but it's not who's going to be wearing the C because they've got that, right? They already decided on Lowry. He's the next captain. What I'm talking about is who's playing center for the Jets long-term. Mark Scheifele might not be here for much longer. Maybe he spends the whole season here. I have no idea. There's not really been any sort of movement either way. We don't know if he's open to a short-term deal. We don't even know if the Jets are interested in having him back. So in the meantime, things are kind of suspended, I guess. You just have to sort of hope that they figure out something here pretty soon. At this point, I don't even care if they resign or trade him. Just make a decision either way so that there's some sort of clarity and at least the chance for the Jets to sort of plan long-term for how they're going to deal with this. Because down the middle, the Jets have quite a few players who can arguably play this role and do it well. I think the big thing the Jets are going to want to test is whether or not Cole Perfetti can become, a legitimate top 6 center. We've seen projected lineups where people are kind of looking at that. It's something that I think, the coaching staff has talked about. And this is like a real chance for Cole to show off why he might honestly be the best choice amongst a lot of the Jets youngsters to anchor a top 6 center role. Perfetti, he's not the fastest. He doesn't have like the most high-end skating, but what he does have is an extreme defensive work ethic, great passing and vision, almost a supernatural sense of space, amazing vision, all of that stuff. And you think about it and you're like, why isn't he playing down the middle? I mean, this is like a perfect player to become a center at the NHL level. And so I think during this camp, and I'm sure they've been talking about it, maybe even testing it out here and there, but I think this preseason is a really big chance for him to show that he might be best suited for that 2C role. I think Nemesnikov did it about as well as you could ask last year, but he's not really a top 6 center. He's a guy who's more of like a really solid middle 6 kind of player. And so I think you want to make sure that you're maximizing offensive potency of that top six. Because like if you look at the Jets roster, that top nine is pretty venomous. And if you arrange it the right way, the Jets are going to have 3 legitimate scoring lines. So yeah, some stuff to be excited about there. The other center candidate is going to be, of course, Gabe Vilardi. I think that is a question that Winnipeg is going to want to figure out because Vilardi, I think, spent a decent chunk of his time on the wing, but we know that in the past, I believe it was in junior, what was it, with Windsor maybe, he used to play down the middle. So I think for me, Gabe Vilardi legit is a really versatile player. I kind of wonder if Winnipeg is going to feel like he is long-term a center. I don't know. I think this is a tough question. I think the Jets, are going to base part of this decision on whether or not Scheifele stays and whether or not one of the other centers on this team really steps up. I feel like he doesn't have that much competition, relatively speaking, especially if Scheifele leaves, because like Vilardi is one of the few top liners on this team. He's one of the few guys with some really good experience down the middle. I know that a lot of guys can play this role, but I think Vilardi is kind of poised to, at some point, if he's, especially if he sticks around, kind of assume that spot. I think, Brad Lambert long-term, he's likely a winger. I think that's his best spot. Connor Levis is probably at some point a center for the Jets, but more in your like middle to bottom six. And other than that, you don't really have a ton of like high-end centers who are going to slot in here. So if this is like a chance to see, maybe Vilardi and Perfetti as the centers of the future for this team, I'm kind of down for it. I hope that they really thrive. I think it'd be great to give the Jets organization some peace of mind down the middle because, the bottom six, their centers are basically set. Whether you have Nemesnikov or Lowry, it really doesn't matter. You have all of these guys who can anchor those roles. But the top six, that is still a question that is in progress. So, a lot to consider. One guy I kind of wonder about, and I'm very interested to know what happens with him in this preseason, is David Gustafsson. You've heard me rave about his work ethic. You know that I'm personally a very big fan of his skill. Obviously, it hasn't translated to very many NHL points at all, and it's also not been the role that he's been asked to play. But if he is starting to be given more responsibility this year, he's a player that I have a very big soft spot for and somebody that I think would be really important to watch long term. So keep an eye on Gustafsson. Hopefully he stays healthy. Hopefully he has a big camp because when it comes to underrated skill and somebody who I think has the potential to really pop off, Gus might be one of the most intriguing sleepers on this team, kind of like in that Rasmus Kupari class. So keep an eye out for Gus, but let me know which centers you think are likely to anchor Winnipeg's top 9 long-term. Maybe there's a center out there that you think the Jets should actually acquire. Drop those names in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. In just a little bit, though, we just talked about the center role being up for debate. I also want to talk about a couple of other battles and some players who might be on the inside track and some guys who might be on the outside looking in as roster competitions are going to start heating up for depth roles. We'll dive into all of that in just a moment, but before we go any further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when they place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. And honestly, if you are somebody who maybe doesn't predict the best when it comes to sports, especially me, you gotta love having at least a little bit of extra bonus bets back, even if things don't go the way you expect. But hey, as a Ravens fan, I think I know how the Ravens are going to end this season. They're going to be hoisting a trophy. I'm kidding, mostly. But you know what? Whether they win or lose, it really couldn't be easier. I can just go onto FanDuel and get in on the action right now because they've got stuff for spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. Getting started really couldn't be easier. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season in style. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every dayers, thank you so much for joining us in tonight's closing thoughts as we really prep ahead for what should be a pretty eventful preseason. I'm expecting the Jets to be pretty fun to watch. I think this team has a lot of potential. And speaking of potential, you know what? This is where we're going to see some really difficult roster decisions because I feel like this year, the Jets, especially up front, have a really good selection of talent. And the bottom six, I think, is going to be one of the hardest things to figure out. For the inside, I would say track to these spots, somebody like Mason Appleton, I think, is very much on Bones' mind for a bottom six role, probably on the third line. Ideally, it would have been the fourth line, but I think we all know they love to have him with Lowry on the third, so it is what it is. I'd pencil him in as probably your third line right wing. Other than that, Alex Scheifele obviously will be in the middle six somewhere, most likely at Lowry's hip on the third line. I think, Lowry, Scheifele, and Appleton is certainly an all right third line. But after that, the fourth line, other than Kupari, I feel is completely open to interpretation, right? I think that there's a lot of competition. Barron, I think, has a pretty good inside track for a spot. Honestly, I would have been happier if Barron was given a more prominent role with the team. But, if he gets on the fourth line, as long as he's getting ice time for the Jets, he's going to provide some good value. So I'm excited for him. I think David Gustafsson is a guy who's kind of like really fighting for a spot at this point. And honestly, it's going to be weird because like Kupari, I would expect to be the fourth line center, but if he goes, out to wing, then you have a spot for Gus that's more natural to his skill set. Because like as a winger, I haven't loved what I've seen from Gus. I think down the middle is just more suited to his skill sets. I think that's where he's more likely to thrive. And it just makes sense that that's his best position, right? As a winger, he's not bad, but it's certainly not how he approaches the game, especially the forecheck, defensive responsibilities, and kind of how he likes to control the center space and set up passing and shooting lanes. So that's one, you might want to keep an eye on. I also feel like Christian Reichel is going to be fighting for a role here because he's had a couple of spot starts for the Jets, a couple of call-ups, but, nothing really concrete. So he's not really got a lot of time before I think he starts thinking about his longer-term future. He's not old or anything. He's relatively young, like 24-ish or so. But I think even he recognizes that the number of opportunities to really make an impression on this team are pretty narrow. So he really needs to have a big camp because I think otherwise he's going to be a guy that's kind of relegated to call-up duty again. And I feel like Reichel has shown enough to where I'm intrigued by his skills. I think he's got something in the tank. I'm curious to know if he's able to really display it for the Jets during preseason. But, if not, at least he's going to be a really good force for the Moose. On defense, I feel like there's probably the smallest battle possible just because there's really no spots. Unless something really changes, this Jets blue line is basically fixed. They love Pionk. They love DeMello. They love Morrissey. Dylan, he's probably not going anywhere. Schmidt, of course, we know is not going anywhere unless he gets traded. So you're basically down to one spot, and it's like Sandberg, right? Unless something really happens where there's a big shakeup with the blue line unit, I just don't know how any of Heinola, Chisholm, Nyazov, or anyone else is supposed to actually fight for a role here. Now, maybe that's because there's stuff going on behind the scenes and the Jets are actually working on opening a spot. But otherwise, you know what? I mean, Stanley is going to be basically a press box guy, and the same can be said for Capobianco. I think those guys, as like injury depth and press box fodder, that's probably what the Jets are going to ask of them. I guess at the very least, they're going to make some cash. But, otherwise, I think Winnipeg doesn't really have any blue line spots open for any prospects. So I think that competition is going to be pretty boring because like Sandberg is just too good. He really can't be benched. I think he should absolutely be in the starting lineup. And that basically means that there's no other spots for D prospects. So I think all the competition is going to happen up front. I think that should be a really exciting battle. it'd be nice if the Jets can do some stuff to make the blue line battle a little bit more intriguing. So something to keep an eye on in case the Jets maybe make a move, something that could even free up cap space here over the next few weeks. But until then, we'll keep an eye out on the Jets roster moves and keep track of preseason as we get into, what should be a pretty fun week of training camp and preseason prep. But for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you back here tomorrow, so don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets, go.